Hello, everyone. This is Kip Creel calling in from Standpoint in Atlanta. Thank you for joining me during my lunch break, at least, for this webinar. There is a Q&A function, so if at any point that you all want to ask some questions, you should see the icon there on the screen, so feel free to post some questions. But without any further explanation, I'm going to dive right into the webinar. The title, I wanted to be a little bit provocative in the title because certainly the topic of Agile innovation is being discussed frequently, and the inspiration for the ultimate oxymoron really came from a client when we were kind of discussing about how to make their innovation process and certainly the research that's done around innovation more agile. And she commented that, well, that's really the ultimate oxymoron. But I do think there are some great lessons here as you think about your innovation process and you think about the types of research that you would do to support the innovation process. Some great lessons that have been learned as we've worked with different clients, and certainly some things that we have sourced through the literature. I think I wanted to preface the discussion with you this afternoon with some information that we have been sourcing through a wide search of the literature. A lot of consulting firms out there do track and monitor what they label to be the best innovators, and typically that's based on some kind of financial metric. Typically it's sort of new revenue or new profit that's contributed by new products developed by the organization. And as we sourced that information, there were some trends that we saw in how these best innovators were using innovation research and then what they actually seek to learn. And there's I think some fairly interesting connections of with these best practices, its impact on agility. And then later on, I'm going to show you a framework that's often used in the front end of innovation and talk a lot about some of the pitfalls that you can face in the front end of innovation and some workarounds to make the overall process much more agile. So some trends that we've seen with so the leading innovators around what they do in understanding their consumers, their customers, end users. And I know we keep hearing this bounced around a lot, but it really is true, is that they indeed are superheroes of empathy. And they really kind of strive on a continuous basis to really put themselves in the shoes of their consumers or customers or end users. They're beginning to recognize, and certainly the tools that we have at our disposal are beginning to recognize, at least from a research perspective, that more and more, that decisions are filtered through emotions. And certainly, as we learn more about brain science, that's certainly being supported. One of the things that we see in terms of really impacting agility, and that's why I highlighted this in blue, is that these leading innovators really strive to get feedback on something as tangible as quickly as possible. So a lot of the work that's done in the front end of innovation is conceptual, and it needs to be, right? We're trying to identify insights, and we're trying to convert those into opportunity areas. But what we keep learning from brain science is that the vast majority of adults are highly sensory people. In other words, that they can't adequately express the value proposition or how an idea or a concept would fit into their life unless they actually can physically touch, taste, feel, smell. And even if it's a low fidelity prototype or just something made out of styrofoam balls and pipe cleaners, but we know that is a really true phenomenon, and we see more and more of the leading innovators working very strongly to get something tangible as quickly as possible. The other thing that I see in terms of sort of improving agility as it relates to the front end of innovation, and also in how they understand their end users. I, and we certainly see this in our own practice, is that the role of research has changed. Research in the past largely was a measurement or a confirmation exercise, and we increasingly see the more agile organizations really using research to align teams and not to use the research really to settle internal disputes. Really, again, kind of going back to using it to inspire and align teams that we're all on the same page. The other thing that I'm noticing with more of these innovative or more agile organizations is they still are comfortable with ambiguity. They don't expect the research to answer all of the questions. What they expect is that the research, and I kind of use the pixelation example here, is that it's going to light up some of the pixels on the computer screen. It's not going to light all of them, and they're more and more accepting of good enough research and not to use the research to kind of bog down the process. And then certainly, and I see this all the time, is that these more agile innovators in terms of their end users is really trying to avoid the analysis paralysis, that these good innovators are great, and more agile innovators are great at having some evidence, but also making very confident and well-informed leaps of faith. I think this is a fairly common trend, and we see this, I think, accelerating, even with the clients that we deal with as it relates to research and also relates to the front end of innovation. But in terms of how they manage the front end, is that they're pulling the learning forward and pushing decisions much later. So if you just kind of think about sort of a simple product launch process of going from definition to launch, much more rapid learning cycles occurring earlier in that process. And really the goal is to, learn as much as possible to avoid problems downstream. And then because you're pushing the decisions later, they're maintaining the flexibility as long as possible so they can respond. And as they learn more, as the market changes, they're not getting tripped up in their launch decisions. And I think we all know this, particularly those that have been but I thought this was important to repeat as it relates to sort of these best innovators, that they never really ask people what they want or what they like, that they really try to more fall in love with the customer's need or fall in love with the customer's problems, more so than the organization falling in love with the ideas that the organization has. And again, as it relates to agility and some of the best innovators, what we're seeing is that, again, this has been documented by many of the consulting organizations, but some of the leading innovators continue to invest heavily in the front end while also running the core business. They're very good at idea management. They're very open to getting ideas from multiple channels, but they never empty the bucket, because as they learn things, it may strengthen or weaken ideas that are in the hopper. And as it relates to innovation research, these best innovators, and I think this is directly related to agility, is they use innovation research to kill early, kill fast, and kill often. And it also, by doing so, enables them to focus on fewer, bigger launches. And as it relates to the front end, and we're going to speak a little bit more about this, they have some structure to the process for the front end, but they don't force the front end to be too linear. I've seen circumstances where I felt as though the front end was so process driven that it really constrained some of the creativity and some of the conceptual work that needs to happen in an effective management of the front end. And again, these best innovators, some of the best practices that we've seen, that they still have the flexibility in their process, even despite kind of the research. They still have the ability to allow for dark horse candidates or what people consider to be kind of a sleeper idea. They know the difference between an idea and a concept, and the concepts that they strive for are very insight driven. And because we're talking about the front end, they know that the skill sets are very different at the front end versus the skill set that you might have in your commercialization process, like a stage gate like process. Because at the front end, and it goes back to what I alluded to before, is you got to have some structure, not too much, because there are a lot of skill sets involved in the effective implementation of the front end. You've got to have some creativity. You've got to have great active listening. You've got to have empathy. You've got to have great storytelling capabilities. You've got to have great observational skills. And those sometimes can't be constrained by an overly rigorous process in the front end. And then lastly, with these great innovators, and again, the things I highlighted in blue here, I think really also connect to innovation, is they actually have a really sharp definition for what they consider to be innovative. And I think it's extremely important when you're scoping an innovation assignment is set some expectations as to what would be considered innovative. Oftentimes we do fall into the trap, even in investing in the front end, is we get too much incrementality. And I think in terms of the scoping process at the beginning, having that sharp definition is extremely important for the organization and certainly any of the outside consultants or outside parties that you may involve in that process. And at the end of the day, it goes back to, and we have to continue to use the research to determine this, is that obviously it's not novelty, but all of the learning that we do in the research process has to make sure that we continue to understand how the idea or how the concept is going to create value. It's extremely important. And the best innovators certainly have demonstrated that they understand value creation, and they use value creation as a criteria to kill projects or to advance projects in their innovation process. Okay, so I wanted to transition and talk a little bit about Agile learning in the front end of innovation. So as I alluded to before, that I want to focus largely on the front end of innovation, and I just put together a simple graphic here to talk about, as we all know, sort of the space that I'm referring to. But it is, a lot of people, if you relate it back to a standard stage gate process, we sometimes jokingly refer to this as gate zero, right? It's sort of all of that problem identification, opportunity identification, and filling that bucket, right, with the ideas and concepts that you then would pull through your innovation process like a stage gate process. And certainly, I think we could all agree that the goal of the FEI is to ensure that the highest potential concepts get into your commercialization process. There's a lot of disagreement actually of where the front end and stage gate type processes link up, and it's going to differ from firm to firm. In some cases, with some clients, there's a much clearer separation. Most cases, the investment in the front end is actually linking up to building the business case. So that tends to be the most common linkage. And a heavier investment in the front end of innovation allows those firms to skip through like gate 3 probably a lot quicker than they would had they not done the investment in the front end. But again, there's a lot of debate about that, but I want to focus largely on the left side of the screen. So the framework that we use in describing the front end, we refer to it as a SCORE framework. And SCORE stands for Scope, Consult, Originate, Refine. And the last part, the E, could be an experiment or where you're evaluating some of your final concepts or your final prototypes. This follows very similar conventions for design thinking. And the color codes there indicate what normally is an internal activity versus the steps where you potentially should or could engage with a consumer, customer, or end user. So the scope is, as I alluded to before, it's simply determining what is in and out of bounds of the assignment. And I'm going to go into a great more detail for each of these steps. The consult generally is where we would engage with the consumer, customer, end user to listen and observe. And then we take that data and we use that to form insights and frame opportunities. And there is within this process, inside this front-end framework, a process for forming insights and framing opportunities. We won't get into that to great detail, but it's very much an internal activity. And there are things that you can do to determine the quality of the insight and also the quality of the opportunity before you advance to later stages. And then the originate is obviously where you're going to generate ideas and concepts. Refinement is development, further development of those concepts or low fidelity prototypes. And as you advance through the process, things are becoming more concrete, right? You're getting higher fidelity prototypes, you're getting much tighter concepts. What's really interesting to know here is that these activities span the concrete and the abstract, which is one of the reasons I alluded to before, is that the skill sets that are required by internal teams and even the consumer or customer end user are very different as you move through this process. Scoping and engaging with your end user, your customer, is a very concrete exercise. The abstractness gets into forming the insights and framing the opportunities. This is where you have to really understand what the definition of an insight is. And you also have to recognize what a good insight versus not a good insight is, and then convert that into opportunity spaces, and a collection of opportunity spaces become your innovation roadmap. Once that very conceptual exercise is done, as you can see, even the ideation is even more abstract, and then you're going to be moving toward more concrete exercises. There are a lot of pitfalls, right, as you move through this process, because particularly in the areas that are very divergent, such as forming insight, framing opportunities, and ideation, and even in the refine stage, lots of trip ups because those processes are more abstract and more divergent. You have to manage that. So I want to kind of walk you through some things that you can do to sort of manage each of those steps. So let's start with scoping. In our experience, these are the leading reasons and killers of agility in the front end of innovation that can be directly tied back to the scoping process. And more often than not, it is where the business strategy and sort of the innovation strategy are not aligned. And you'll get calls and say, hey, we need to do front end of innovation. And oftentimes it's not clear if the innovation process or what is even needed. I go back to the ANSOF matrix, right, which we probably all learned in business school, that you see on the right-hand side. What's the strategic mandate? Is it more necessary for you to develop new products? Is this really about increasing penetration of maybe some existing products? Is this developing new markets, actually going to new geographies? Or is this completely a diversification strategy? That conversation is extremely important very early on, and it's surprising how often it doesn't happen, because how you approach the innovation assignment really depends on what actually is the strategy here. So a combination of new or existing markets, new and existing products, has huge implications. The other thing that we see is that the innovation lens is too broad or it's too narrow. So let me give you an example. We recently completed an assignment for a pet product manufacturer. They manufacture food, treats, for cats and dogs, and also chews that you would give to a dog. And the original scope when we were approached was to cover all of that. And it's just way too broad to address all of those product categories and all of those, dog and cat owners all together. And as we continue to peel back and sort of understand the strategy, really the business problem was that they felt that there were increasingly a number of rejectors of the ingredients that this company was having in its products. And so that's very different, and it's a much, much more manageable type of scope for an innovation assignment. And going in too broadly, you're going to get nothing that's actionable. Going in too narrowly, you're going to get too much incrementality. So it's an extremely important conversation in the beginning to make sure that this assignment is scoped properly. And if it's scoped too broadly, you're going to trying to address too many customers, too many consumers, too many end users in one assignment. It's going to be unmanageable, not going to be actionable. The other thing that we see happening is that you want to focus on too many types of innovation. Sometimes it's like, hey, let's cover off on product, let's cover off on services, business model, claims, merchandising, in-store experience, all of these things. It's too much. So it has to be scoped properly for the most maximum impact. So extremely important that you get the scope right. Takes time, takes a lot of conversation to sort of dig down and really understand how this links up to the broader strategy and sort of overall, it's like ultimately where the biggest business problems. During the consult phase, again, this is where you kind of go out and engage, right, with the consumer, customer, end user. The biggest killer agility here is that you've got limited research dollars, and again, they're just spread across too many targets. You can't get enough depth, right? So a food manufacturer comes to us and, wants to understand organics, right? How people, and well, that's just, again, there's so many subsegments even within organics that it might just be unmanageable. So it goes back to the extent that you can to really hone in on, again, those segments that you want to engage during the consult phase. And what happens is that if it's scoped too broadly during that research phase, you're invariably going to discover all of these subgroups. Let's say that we go in with organics, well, then there's going to be people that are maybe vegetarian or vegans, or, they're into like clean food or, GMO. Well, you got all these subgroups that have very different needs and motivations that are naturally going to emerge. If you're scoped too broadly, it's going to ruin your research experience and, again, what you're going to learn. So you have to really kind of think about that type of stuff ahead. The other thing that happens is that, and it's very common, that these consult phases extremely productive. You could get a huge volume of needs and motivations and pain points and beliefs. And we largely rely on qualitative research to do this. And what happens sometimes is you come out of this consult phase with really no clear idea of the actual prevalence or priority of these needs, motivations, and pain points, beliefs, and all of that stuff in your target population. So if you try, and then you convert all these into opportunity areas, you're going to have too many opportunity areas. Same thing with during the ideation, what we call originate. Killers of agility is you ideate around too many opportunity areas instead of focusing on the top priorities. You get a large volume of ideas, right, with no clear understanding of what actually is important to the target. We see ideas that are advanced based on subjective criteria or maybe internal consensus voting. And you get no real confirmation that the idea that was generated, either with internal teams or external teams, that it connects back to the fundamental need, insight, or problem that the consumer had to begin with. So All these things can really, really slow down your agility in the front end. During the refine stage, where you're taking ideas or preliminary concepts and you're trying to improve them and really flesh out the value proposition, you got too many. You got a large volume of these concepts, and again, without some direction or guidance, you really don't understand what is important to the target. And I see this a lot where then you get into debate and indecisiveness as to what features to include or exclude, right, in the creation of this preliminary concept. Then you start getting into price point debates. Well, if you include this, it's going to increase the price. If you take this, and we don't really understand with the consumer at this point or the customer at this point what those trade-offs look like. And in the evaluate stage, which is your final stage, again, obviously things are going to kill agility is you got too many concepts at a time. A lot of the quantitative techniques that are used with the evaluate, sometimes it comes back and there's very little discrimination in the results between concepts. So which one is truly winning? It's hard to say. And then as I alluded to before, and what we're seeing with the best innovators is there's an over-reliance on testing concepts versus something that's more tangible. Concept testing has a role, but what we know from brain science is the vast majority of people take in information from their senses. And I just think that we're over-reliance on that. Is there a way to get something tangible in front of people as early as possible? I think it's extremely important. And I think there's an over-reliance on purchase intent, excuse me, versus gauging kind of the intensity of the reaction to an idea, or even getting more of a behavioral response to an idea. I read something recently that there's emerging data now that says the correlation between purchase intent and sort of like actually what happens is like 0.35. So it's like 35% of the time it's right, and that means 70+% of the time or 65% of the time it's wrong. And I'm not sure that those are always odds, right? That that organizations continue want to take. So how do we continue in this process to get more behavioral responses to these ideas than relying on responses to really something that's nothing more than an abstraction? And then depending on your industry, right, we have few comparative benchmarks. So if we get great reaction to this idea, is 60% good or is 30% good? It's kind of hard to say. So what do we do? So the key to managing all of these pitfalls is to very selectively and strategically build in cycles of convergence, particularly in those areas that are naturally divergent, right? There are big aspects of the front end of innovation that are highly abstract. And if you don't manage that abstraction, you're going to be drinking from a fire hose. And at the end of this assignment, it's not going to be that effective for you. We recommend a high degree of convergence, right, as I already alluded to during the scoping process. Let's really sit down and as tightly as we can define the parameters. After you get through this process of forming the insights and framing the opportunities, how do we narrow things down to the biggest opportunities before we even get into ideation? And same thing as we go through the refine and the evaluation process, how do we continue to build in these cycles of convergence? Here's some recommendations. So in the scoping process, and I think I'm going to keep beating this drum, is don't rush this step and don't bite off more than you can chew. So develop very tight parameters for the assignment, and you may have to do some preliminary market research, right, or trends analysis to sort of help sort of say, where do we land this assignment? So if you see, I'm going to use a bad example, but if you see like growth in foods that are not genetically modified, and that trending information, right, is happening early on. That information is going to help scope the assignment. Something that I see an absence of is just basic segmentation. You can certainly invest in a segmentation study, but oftentimes just leveraging your institutional knowledge and saying, in our playing field, what are the different personas that we have, and which of these personas, right, are going to be our priorities? So spend the time to identify those priority target consumers, customers, end users, because it will give you the focus with whom to conduct the research, and it'll make life so much easier downstream when you get to ideation and concept building, because everybody is super clear on this is the more precisely defined target that we're speaking of at this point in time. Reduces a lot of downstream debate. And as we know, having a precisely defined target consumer, customer, end user is an essential component of the business case, and they have pretty durable shelf lives, depending on your market, of 3 to 5 years. So if you've not gone through the exercise of segmenting the different consumers and subgroups that are in your playing field and making some choices, I highly recommend it before you jump off into this front end of innovation process. What can you do at the consult phase? So, as I alluded to before, is that largely we rely on qualitative research, right? We use focus groups or in-depth interviews to talk to people. We use ethnography and shop-alongs and all of these things to observe people, and there's all kinds of other techniques. But just because you've done a lot of that observation and listening, you can't assume at that point that you actually know the prevalence and the actual priority of these customer, consumer, end user insights. And again, I use insights as an umbrella term that sort of rolls up needs, pain points, beliefs, motivations, all of that stuff that we're looking for. Consult phase can be very productive. So how do you build in a cycle of conversions? Well, you could consider an intermediate quantitative study here to quantify the proportion of this target consumer that has this motivation, or that has this belief, or that experiences this need. And what we find is that consumers are actually much better at articulating those things than they are telling you what they would buy or what they don't buy, right? So it reinforces what these best innovators are doing, is that they're falling in love with the consumer need, the consumer problem, and not the idea. And consumers are much better at telling you that, and it's very easy to measure those belief statements and those motivations in the population. I advocate spending more money on quantifying this type of stuff than spending more money on sort of traditional concept testing. Because if you can confirm that the idea is connected back to the need, I think that's all you need to know. And then you frame these opportunity areas around the insights that are the most prevalent or underserved, or the highest priority, or that are unique, right? That maybe somebody else is not addressing. And it brings considerable focus to your ideation, and you're building solutions around the highest priority opportunity areas. What do you do after ideation or during ideation? Well, I think we all know this instinctively, and if you've been part of an ideation, it too can be overwhelming. It can be again drinking from a fire hose. Hopefully, you've reduced the number of inputs to the ideation, right, based on the advice that I've given you prior. But even a well-managed ideation with 3, 4, 5 opportunity areas, it's not uncommon to get 100, 200 plus ideas. And you can manage these ideas a lot of different ways. The first thing that you have to do with your team is make sure that everyone in that ideation session can articulate how an idea is linked back to the opportunity area, right? Sometimes we get into ideation and we like, even though we're framing the ideation around a specific opportunity area, you want that process to be divergent, right? And sometimes people just start throwing out ideas that are not even remotely connected to the opportunity area. You have to go through and call those ideas down and have an honest conversation. Is this linked? Can we see a direct link to this idea back to the consumer insight or customer insight? If the answer is no, then park it. And you can prioritize ideas, again, based on customer reaction and perceived feasibility. And I'm not saying you have to do research here, but we know the strength of the opportunity area, right, relative, the strength of the insight. So even the ideation team, and hopefully you've got some marketing and R&D people, is you can sift through all of these ideas and winnow those ideas down significantly based on the strength of the opportunity area and perhaps what is perceived feasibility at this time. I hate sticky dots. I mean, it's a popularity contest, but it's a much, much more meaningful conversation if you can look at these ideas and get the team aligned on this is high feasibility, low feasibility, high impact area, low impact area, and you literally come up with a 2x2 grid, right? And you can significantly cull down these ideas of things to take the next steps. Deprioritize the ideas that are not well differentiated, right? That often does not happen during ideation. And if you screen ideas with the end user or the customer or the consumer, rely less on likability or purchase intent, because honestly, the value proposition may not be fully understood at this point. But I say judge the idea based on the potential to solve a known need or problem or their link to the motivation. And sometimes we just take some of these ideas back to qualitative research and have further discussions to call those down. And if quantitative methods are in the wheelhouse for this assignment, make sure you use methods that provide more discrimination between options. There's a lot of great quantitative techniques to say, hey, if you had your choice, would you want A or B, right? Or would you want C or F or this? And you can randomize these options, and it puts more discrimination around these options. And there's also many emerging techniques where ideas are being screened, literally based on time to respond, right? If you don't like the idea, you're going to swipe it. If you like the idea, you're probably going to spend a little bit more time investigating it. So kind of like we talk about more implicit reactions to ideas. The thing that you should never do, and remember this is a key distinction for the best innovators, is even though they've called these ideas down, they never empty the bucket. And I can guarantee you in the 30 innovation assignments that we did last year, 29 of the clients called me back and said, we need software, we need a process to manage all of these ideas. So there has to be an infrastructure in place to manage the ideas, and there has to be a person responsible for managing the ideas. It's extremely important because even an idea didn't make the cut here, if you're doing rapid learning, there's going to be something else that you're going to learn, or there's going to be something else that's happened in the market that you want to be able to rapidly pull that idea out of your hopper and run with it. And I see too often great ideas leaving an ideation session and they vanish. Extremely, extremely important. So during the refine stage, excuse me, again, the goal here is to really hone in on the value proposition to get those tangible and intangible benefits flushed out and make sure that you really understand priority features and then work to kill the weaker ideas quickly. I highly, highly, highly recommend co-creation here. If you haven't done it, fantastic. You don't need, hundreds of people to involve with this, but you can re-engage with the consumer, the customer, the end user to help you make these choices, right? Use their voice, right, to guide this process. I see too many innovation teams talking in the bubble with themselves at this stage about having those debates. I want to put this feature in or this benefit, and you go back and forth, back and forth. The best way to level the playing field is to pull your consumer, customer, end user back in. And quite frankly, we often recycle some of the same people that we talked to during the consult phase, right? You already have a relationship with them, and you say, wow, that was a really good participant. Pull them forward to this next phase, okay? And judge the preliminary concept, again, on the value creation. Do they believe that the solution is going to solve for that need or pain point? It's not a likability exercise. You can work with them to establish feature prioritization. You can easily do card sorts in the face-to-face or even virtual environment where people can make trade-offs. Like if I add this, it's going to cost this. If I take this away, it's going to cost this. And that as you introduce features, the key in these conversations is to make sure that the consumer, customer, end user can directly look at you in the face and articulate the benefit that that feature is going to bring. Extremely important. And you can begin to gauge early pricing expectations and then advance these preliminary concepts to next steps where the value proposition is the strongest. A lot of great kill decisions can be made at this stage. A lot of great, because again, we're looking for kill fast, right? Kill early, kill often, all about value creation. And I think this is a critical step. And that's why I'm a big believer in co-creation. Get them involved. So lastly, with the evaluate and the experiment, I want to talk a little bit is that this too is an important step. And what we typically rely on here is concept testing. And I'm going to also kind of share with you some things to think about that for the future. So, with a concept test, as I alluded to before, I think they should be used judiciously. I think that they do have merit. And I think oftentimes, that the thing that we lack in a concept testing is that we don't get that intensity of reaction, right? As most of you probably know with concept testing, there are a couple different ways that you can approach it. But typically, you want to test 4 to 5 variants, right, on the same core need or problem. And then there's monadic and sequential, but basically monadic is considered the gold standard, where basically a single survey respondent sees one of the variants because there is interaction effects between the concepts. It takes large sample sizes to do that. So oftentimes in business to business, where we may have sample sizes of 30 people, we don't have the luxury of doing that. And that's sequential monadic, where a single survey respondent sees all of the offerings. And there's other designs out there. One of the big benefits, obviously, of monadic is you can vary the price point, right? And then it actually allows you to produce a demand curve. The thing that we don't do, right, is measure something believability, right? After you've read the concept, I just think purchase intent is too vague. What I think is really important is reconfirm, hey, you told us you had this problem. To what degree does you think this concept is going to solve that problem, right? I think that's the key metric. So in general, concept testing is a good technique, not perfect. And as I alluded to before, the correlations between purchase intent and actual purchase in consumer goods is about 0.35 to 0.50. It is much lower in business to business, and a lot of risk here because a poorly written concept without doing all of this previous work is futile, because poorly written concept, you're going to get poor results. You're going to get results you can't rely on. So here are some things that are emerging that I think we all should consider. And we have more and more clients that are dabbling with these things, and we're getting really good results. One of the things that we do this in surveys, we do this in qualitative research, and I think it's a question that you can ask, especially face to face. And I am finding people will be honest with you. Would you go out and buy this today? Like, would you, I mean, is there like, I gotta have this type of reaction, getting that intensity of response? And that's, I think, in business to business, extremely important. Would you go out and buy this today? And sometimes you could see it like, if you had this, I would go buy it. And sometimes it's like, well, you know, I need more data, or I need more reasons to believe, or, you know, or I need to kind of see somebody else use it. I mean, there's all these barriers that are thrown up. And, but would you go out and buy this today tells you, yes, this has a strong enough value proposition for me. I can see it. I believe that I would experience it. The other thing that we do sometimes in surveys, and again, this is like a behavioral response, is we ask people, this works quite well in consumer surveys, is sign up here. Would you like to be the first to know when this product is available, right? They might have given you high purchase intent, but if they say, yeah, I'll sign up here and let me be the first to know when this product is available, like that, taking that extra step, that sort of is another thing that we use to kind of gauge true interest in an idea or a concept. There's a lot of experimentation going on with what we call hedonic scale, but like think about like using emoticons, right? Like you use Facebook and you express sort of how you feel, right, about an idea. And in some cases, people can use emoticons. There's a good deal of reliability and validity in some situations with kind of using these types of scales. With some clients who have the ability to do this, we have a food client who has their own in-house commissary, so they can produce small volumes of product. We're actually putting the product on their e-commerce site and doing A/B tests to actually get a behavioral response among actual real consumers as to whether or not they would buy this product. Some cases we actually ship the product to the consumer, and then we can follow up and say, did it taste good? You know, would you buy this again? In some cases, it's not even a real product. It's literally on the e-commerce site, it is just a concept. And then we have experimented with telling the consumer, hey, oh, sorry, we're sold out, or hey, actually, this is not a real product, but we just, you know, but would you be willing to talk to us more about it? So it can also be a good tool to enroll people into kind of follow-up conversations. But you're getting that behavioral response, which I think is extremely important. I even know of another food client that has completely eliminated concept tests. And again, like I said, they're just running small batches of product and just taking it out to retail and putting it in front of people and saying, you know, would you buy this? Like, try this sample, would you buy this? And I know some of the food manufacturers are having really good success with that. We also also have solutions, again, where we're measuring implicit reactions. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these implicit reactions are pretty reliable and pretty valid. So in other words, and this is particularly important in business to business, is that the more engaged someone is with an idea, the more time they spend reading the concept or clicking through a concept, or taking efforts with a concept, it's indicative of engagement and strength of the value proposition. So we have a solution that presents concepts kind of in like an Amazon.com interface, and we monitor their level of engagement with these ideas and concepts in that fashion, and it's these implicit reactions that we're looking at, in addition to explicit reactions through purchase intent or, you know, maybe some open-ended commentary. And as I said before, some firms, because they're trying to be more agile and they have the ability to do this, is they're just foregoing this last step altogether and employing, again, more rapid prototyping and kind of in-field testing. And honestly, in a lot of business-to-business applications where the cost to conduct, a quantitative evaluation, and you're going to get a sample size of 30 people if you're lucky, may be comparable of just taking some type of low fidelity prototype out to a handful of customers. I mean, so you have to kind of think about these different kinds of trade-offs at that step. So a couple closing thoughts for you. So again, the secret to managing these pitfalls is building in these cycles of convergence, right? At the scope and the consult phase, get tightly defined parameters, get a precisely a defined target consumer end user that you can. And that happens during the scope and consult phase. And this framing the opportunities and these insights, build your innovation roadmap around the biggest opportunities, right? Quantitative research can be used to measure reaction to these insights, the prevalence and priority. Limit your ideation to the priority opportunity areas. And then, as we do in the Originate, significantly call the ideas down. Engage the consumer and users to help through co-creation to build these concepts and kill them as quickly as possible. And at the last step, just know the limitations and really think about some of the emerging techniques to give you more confident decision-making at this step. So a couple other sort of things that I would leave you with just to chew on. So in the front end of innovation, sometimes I think we think and we lean toward that the quality of the feedback is versus the quantity of feedback is more important. Kill ideas that have no link to the insight, and you have to hold people accountable first for evaluating the quality of the insights and then constantly asking that question, does it link back? Does it link back? If people cannot see and see that and connect those dots, it needs to be deprioritized. Again, fall in love with the customer need, not the ideas. Co-develop with end users. And I hear this a lot in business to business. They're like, hey, we want to engage with our customer, but they're just not forthcoming. Well, my answer to that is, well, go talk to your customer's customer, or even higher in the food chain, because somebody's needs in the ecosystem is driving the market. And if you go talk to your customer's customer and say, hey, did you know this about your customer? It's going to open the door for your customer to sit down and have a conversation to understand what their needs are, right? So that's how you bring value to them from a research perspective. Focus on insights and behaviors. Challenge your team. Is this a fact or an insight? If you're doing this FEI and you want to involve your team in the front end, we got to consider skill sets. You need people that have high on empathy, that are high on active listening, and high on observation. You can test for those skills. You can decide who on your team should be involved at different stages in the front end based on the requisite skills that are needed throughout that process. And FEI relies on feedback from real people. How do we, and there are ways to do this, foster greater storytelling? Like, how do we get a customer to tell us a better story? How do we tap into the creativity and problem-solving capacity of the customers, consumers, and users that we're engaging? There are ways to do that. And I think you've heard me say this before. Utilize quantitative methodologies judiciously. Winnow a large volume of ideas. Measure prevalence, intensity of things, product and price optimization. But just know that a survey, which is still like the leading tool that's out there, is still not the best method for an insight. And you have options when it comes to quantitative, other than just the standard survey. So I would leave you, hopefully, with some good advice and some things to think about as you're looking to launch a front end of innovation assignment, and also just to build more agility into the process. So we have just a few minutes. If there are any questions, just pop on the Q&A function. I'll be able to read those. I will make sure that all of you who attended get a copy of the presentation. And this webinar that has been recorded, it'll be on our website, and we'll notify you of that as well. But if there are any questions, hopefully you can find that app on the screen. Just go ahead and type away. Looks like everybody's ready to go do some Christmas shopping. So I don't see any questions. So I'll just go ahead and just hang out for a couple more minutes. My email address is below on the screen there, kprill@standpointgroup.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. So if you have questions, feel free to email me and I will get to you as quickly as I can. Hope you all have a great holiday season. Thank you for your time, and we'll be in touch with the follow-up items that were promised. Bye now.